Hey there! Tonight we are going somewhere very quiet. Somewhere the wind moves slowly across open grass and the water of a dark lake sits perfectly still, reflecting nothing but a pale sky. Somewhere that, if you look carefully, if you stand in exactly the right place and let your eyes go soft and unfocused, you can almost feel the ghost of something vast and human and long gone pressing up through the earth beneath your feet. Tonight we are going to Wales, to the Glamorgan coast, to a wide golden sweep of dunes that stretches along the edge of the Bristol Channel like a sleeping giant buried under centuries of shifting sand. And somewhere down there, under those dunes, under as much as 30 meters of compacted, wind-blown sand in some places, is a town, a real town, with streets and walls, and a great stone castle, and a guild hall, and a hospital, and 2 churches, and hundreds of people who once lived and worked and argued and laughed and grew old and died there. A medieval English borough, planted in the Welsh wilderness in the early 1200s, and then slowly, grain by grain, storm by storm, decade by decade, swallowed whole. This is the story of Kenfig, Britain's Pompeii, the town that the sand took.
Before we go any further, a small but genuine request. This channel, Heyo Boring History for Sleep, has been going for over a year now. Over a year of research, writing, recording, and slow narration about the quiet corners of history that most people walk right past. And after all of that time and work, there are still only around 160 of you here, which is both humbling and, I will be honest, a little bit funny. So if these stories help you drift off, if they give your busy mind something slow and interesting to settle into on the way to sleep, please consider clicking like and subscribing. It truly does make a difference. It helps the channel grow, it helps more people find their way here, and it costs you nothing but a moment. Now, back to the sands. Section 1. Into the Dunes, an opening journey. Imagine for a moment that you're standing at the edge of the Kenfig National Nature Reserve on a grey afternoon in late autumn. The kind of afternoon where the light is thin and flat and seems to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The air smells of salt and wet grass and something faintly mineral, the way coastal places always do, as if the sea has been breathing over this land for so long that it has left its chemistry behind in the soil itself. Ahead of you, the dunes rise and fall in long, gentle waves, not steep and dramatic like desert dunes, but soft and rounded, covered in marram grass that hisses and rustles in the wind, a constant low sound that never quite stops. Between the dune ridges there are hollows and slacks, sheltered little depressions where the wind drops and the light seems warmer somehow, where rare orchids grow in spring, and where, in the right season, You might hear the rasp of a grasshopper warbler threading its strange mechanical song through the grass. To your left, through a gap in the dunes, you can see Kenfig Pool. It is a large, still lake, about 60 hectares of dark, calm water, sitting in the middle of all these dunes like a mirror that someone forgot to hang on a wall. The pool reflects the sky in shades of pewter and charcoal, and on rare sunny days, a deep, slightly unreal blue. It is very quiet here. The road is some distance behind you. The industry of Port Talbot, with its great steelworks and its orange sky glow at night, sits just a few kilometres to the south and east, but you would not know it from here. Here the world is grass and wind and water and sand, and somewhere under your feet there is a town.
Not a ruin in the conventional sense. Not tumbled walls and broken columns that you can walk among and photograph and read about on laminated signs, but a buried place, a sealed place, a town that was swallowed so completely and so gradually that it has lain beneath this sand largely undisturbed for the better part of 600 years. Streets are down there, the outlines of houses, the foundations of a great stone castle, a road surface, still metalled and solid, preserved in the dark, pottery, coins, charcoal from fires, the physical residue of hundreds of ordinary human lives, locked in an underground room that no one has a key to. The only thing that breaks the surface is the castle, or rather the top of the castle. Stand in the right place in the reserve and you will see it. A small, ragged protrusion of medieval stonework rising from the base of a dune. Just the uppermost section of the keep, maybe 2 or 3 meters of ancient masonry, with the stone archway of a window frame still visible, its rounded Norman arch perfectly intact. Around it the sand presses close on all sides, patient and heavy and indifferent. Below that few meters of exposed stone, the rest of the castle descends into the earth. The gatehouse is down there, the curtain walls, the bailey, all of it still standing, or close to standing, in the sealed dark beneath the dunes.
When the medieval traveller and antiquary John Leland passed through this part of Wales around the year 1539, he wrote something that has echoed down through the centuries as one of the most evocative epitaphs any settlement has ever received. He wrote that Kenfig was a little village and a castle, both in ruin, and almost choked and devoured with the sands that the Severn Sea casteth up. Almost choked and devoured, as if the sand was something with intention, something hungry, something that had decided over the course of a century and a half that this town needed to be removed from the surface of the world and stored somewhere safer, somewhere quieter. There is a particular kind of historical melancholy that attaches to places like this. Not the sharp grief of sudden disaster, but something slower and stranger. Kenfig was not destroyed in a day like Pompeii. It was not flooded in a night like certain legendary cities. It was pressed down, gently and inexorably over generations, until the people who had built it and loved it and defended it and buried their dead in its churchyards simply ran out of reasons to stay. The sand did not kill Kenfig with violence. It killed it with patience. And in doing so, it preserved it.
That is the extraordinary thing. That is why, when archaeologists finally began to dig here in earnest, what they found was not the confused scatter of a site long disturbed and plundered and built over that you encounter at most medieval settlements. What they found were intact layers, sealed sequences, objects lying exactly where they had been dropped or left or discarded centuries ago in the dark. The anaerobic conditions beneath the dune, the absence of oxygen, the stable temperature, the compression of the sand itself, acted as a kind of slow, cold museum, keeping things that should have rotted long ago in a state of remarkable preservation. Britain's Pompeii. The name is not an exaggeration. It is, if anything, modest. So let us go back. Let us go back to before the sand, to before the storms, to before the Norman castle and the Welsh raids and the royal charters and the gradual quiet catastrophe. Let us go back to the land itself and to what was here before any of it. Section 2, for Name in the Marsh, Ancient Kenfig. The name Kenfig is an anglicisation of the Welsh Kinfig, and there is some debate, pleasantly inconclusive in the way that all the best etymological debates are, about exactly what that name means. The historian Thomas Gray, who wrote a book in 1909 called, straightforwardly enough, The Buried City of Kenfig, believed it derived from the Welsh words meaning head of the swamp. Others have suggested it comes from a phrase that translates roughly as ridge on a marsh. Either way, the landscape is the noun. The place was named right from the beginning for the wet, reedy, uncertain ground on which it sat. Because the land here, before the sand changed everything, was marsh. The river Kenfig, in Welsh the Afon Kynfig, wound its way south through low-lying, waterlogged ground towards the Bristol Channel. The estuary was broad and marshy, the kind of place where the boundary between land and water was more a matter of opinion than geography. Reed beds, sedge, the constant soft movement of tidal water through channels that shifted with the seasons. It was not, in the modern sense, inviting land for settlement. And yet, people were here. Long before the Normans, long before the Welsh kingdoms, long before written history of any kind in this corner of the world. Prehistoric finds from the Kenfig area speak to a human presence stretching back thousands of years. The Glamorgan coast, with its rich maritime resources and its fertile river valleys running back from the sea, was attractive land in the Bronze Age. Flint tools have been recovered from the dune systems at Kenfig and its wider surroundings, the kind of worked stone that someone carried and used and eventually lost in the grass somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years ago. There are also traces of Bronze Age activity in the broader Bridgend and Margam area,
evidence that the landscape we think of as empty and dune-covered was once more open and inhabited than it now appears.
The Romans passed through this part of the world too. Roman pottery has been found in the archaeological record at Kenfig, along with evidence from nearby sites that speaks to the Roman administrative presence along the South Wales coast. The Great Roman Road, connecting the legionary fortresses and towns of Roman Britain, ran not far from here, and the river crossing at the Kenfig would have been a natural stopping point for travellers and soldiers moving along the Welsh coastal routes. Whether there was a formal Roman settlement here, a mansio or a small fort or a farmstead, is not definitively established, but the presence of Roman material in the ground suggests at the very least that people knew this place and used it during those 4 centuries of Roman control. After the Romans withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the land of Glamorgan fell into the hands of the native Welsh kingdoms. This is the period that history books sometimes call the Dark Ages, though modern historians wince at the term, and with some reason, because it was not dark so much as documentary. The kings and chieftains, and the small monastery communities, and the farming settlements of post-Roman Wales left fewer written records than the Romans had. But they were still here, still building, still praying, still fighting and trading and dying in this wet, green corner of the island.
The river crossing at Kenfig would have remained significant. Rivers were the roads of the early medieval world in many ways. You followed them to travel. You crossed them at established fords and ferries. You defended the crossings because whoever controlled the river crossing controlled the movement of people and goods and armies. The low mound on which the later Norman castle would be built stands beside the river Kenfig at a natural crossing point. That mound may already have held some kind of Welsh defensive structure before the Normans arrived. There is an early reference in historical records to the site being refortified around 1080 by Iestyn ap Gwrgan, a Welsh king of Glamorgan who was trying to hold his kingdom together against both internal rivals and the relentless pressure of Norman advance from the east. Iestyn ap Gwrgan did not hold it for long. The Normans were coming, and this particular corner of South Wales was squarely in their path. But before we get to the Normans, sit for a moment with this older landscape. Think of the marsh and the river, the reed beds and the tidal channels, the long flat horizon of the Bristol Channel to the south, and on clear days the dark shapes of the Somerset and Devon hills visible across the water. The sky enormous, the light coming off the water in pale shifting sheets. People living here for thousands of years, generation after generation, long before anyone ever thought to build a stone castle, or grant a royal charter, or plant a borough on the edge of the estuary.
Whatever Kenfig was before the Normans made it what it became, it was already something. Already a place where humans had chosen to be. Already a name. Already a small, quiet human fact in a landscape that was itself old and patient
and largely indifferent to the particular dramas of any one century's residents. The sand, too, was already here. Not yet dominant, not yet the agent of slow annihilation that it would become, but the dune system that borders this coast had been forming for centuries, a shifting edge world of blown sand that moved with the winds and changed its shape with the storms and existed in a state of perpetual slow negotiation with the land behind it. The people who lived here must have known the sand, must have watched it move after big storms, must have had at the back of their minds some quiet ancestral knowledge that this was not entirely stable ground. They built on it anyway, because people always do. Section 3. The Normans come. Robert, Earl of Gloucester. To understand why Kenfig was built where it was, and why it was built at all, you need to understand what Norman conquest actually looked like from the inside. Not the great set pieces of 1066 and the invasion of England, which have been written about endlessly, but the slower, dirtier, more incremental conquest of Wales, which went on for generations and was never quite finished, and which involved a very different kind of warfare from the pitched battles and formal submissions of the English campaign.
Wales was not conquered in a year. It was not conquered in a decade. The Normans, following their victory at Hastings in 1066, pushed west and north into Wales in a series of probing, opportunistic advances, establishing castles at strategic points, installing their lords and bishops and sheriffs, pushing back against Welsh resistance, losing ground, regaining it, negotiating, betraying, burning, rebuilding, and always pressing further west. It was a war of attrition, fought in slow motion across a landscape of rivers and valleys and mountains and marshes, and it produced some of the most distinctive and dramatic castles in the whole of Britain. Glamorgan, the fertile, relatively low-lying coastal plain that runs from Cardiff westward towards Swansea, was one of the earlier areas of Wales to be brought under Norman control. The Normans saw its value immediately. Good agricultural land, navigable rivers, access to the Bristol Channel and its trade routes, and a relatively defensible eastern border where the landscape narrowed between the hills and the sea. Robert FitzHammon, one of William the Conqueror's knights, effectively took Glamorgan in the 1090s, establishing the lordship of Glamorgan that would persist in various forms and under various lords for centuries. It was Robert FitzHammon's grandson, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who built Kenfig. Robert was one of the most powerful men in 12th century England and Wales. He was the illegitimate son of King Henry I, and in the politics of that period, being an acknowledged royal bastard was not a disadvantage, but a position of considerable prestige and power. Henry I had a remarkable number of illegitimate children, over 20 that we know of, and Robert was perhaps the most capable and trusted of them. He was given the earldom of Gloucester, which included the lordship of Glamorgan, and he managed both with considerable energy and political intelligence. He needed that intelligence. The western end of Glamorgan,
where the lordship bordered the Welsh lands of Avan, was genuinely dangerous. The Welsh princes and lords of Avan were not going to submit quietly to Norman overlordship. They raided, they burned, they made alliances with other Welsh rulers and mounted coordinated attacks on Norman strongholds. Holding the western frontier of Glamorgan required a permanent armed presence, a fortified base from which Norman authority could be projected, and from which retaliation and defence could be organised. The site beside the river Kenfig presented itself as the obvious choice. The river itself formed a natural defensive boundary to the west and north of the mound. The mound rose above the marshy ground around it, giving height advantage, and the crossing point it commanded was genuinely important. Controlling it meant controlling movement between the Norman lands to the east and the Welsh lands to the west.
The castle that Robert, Earl of Gloucester, built at Kenfig was erected somewhere between 1113 and 1147, the year of his death. Like most early Norman castles, it began as a timber and earth construction, a motte and bailey design, with a wooden keep on the raised mound and a surrounding enclosure, all protected by earthwork banks and a ditch. Timber was what you built with quickly when you needed defensive strength fast. It could be put up in weeks, not years. It could be repaired quickly and cheaply. Its disadvantages, it burned, were well known, but in the urgent early decades of Norman settlement, speed mattered more than permanence. The stone castle came later, with Robert's son William completing the stone keep, the construction of which had begun under Robert, probably around 1186 to 1187. The keep was substantial by the standards of the time and region. It was approximately 50 feet across, that is, around 15 metres, square in plan, with walls of considerable thickness, buttressed at the corners, with an entrance at the southwest corner. The castle historian and writer Peter Davis has described it as the largest castle keep in the county of Glamorgan at that time, which gives some sense of how seriously the Normans took this particular frontier position. Around the castle, almost from the beginning, a settlement grew. This was not accidental. Norman lords actively encouraged the creation of what were called boroughs, organised settlements with defined legal privileges and rights, populated by settlers who owed specific obligations to the lord, and received in return the right to hold markets, run businesses, own property, and live under a defined legal code, rather than under the more uncertain customs of rural feudal life. The borough was a tool of colonisation, as much as it was a form of town planning. It brought in settlers, mostly English, who owed loyalty to the Norman lord, populated the land around his castle, provided services and revenue, and acted as a visible physical assertion of Norman authority in a landscape the Welsh still regarded as their own. By 1183, written records confirm that a substantial borough had developed to the south of the castle. The town of Kenfig was taking shape. It would grow over the next century and a half into something genuinely significant,
a place with all the features and institutions of a proper medieval English town, improbably planted on a marsh at the edge of the Welsh world. And Robert, Earl of Gloucester, who had started all of this, who had chosen this wet and windy spot beside a tidal river, and decided that here is where we will plant our flag, died in the year 1147, having founded not just a castle, but an idea. The idea that this place, this particular patch of marsh and river and coastal sand, was worth fighting for, worth building on, worth calling home.
In 1147, the same year Robert died, he founded Margam Abbey, giving the monks the lands between the rivers Kenfig and Afan. The abbey and the borough would coexist for centuries, their histories tangled together. The monks of Margam recorded what happened in this corner of the world with the patient attention of people who had nothing better to do with their evenings than write things down. We owe them a considerable debt. Section 4. The Borough Grows. Life in Medieval Kenfig. To the people who lived in Kenfig at its height, it was simply home, not a historical curiosity, not a doomed settlement ticking towards its eventual burial, just the place where they lived and worked and ate and slept and raised children and worried about money and prayed for better harvests and argued with their neighbours over the precise location of property boundaries. The town that developed around the castle at Kenfig was a proper medieval borough in the full technical and social sense of the term. It had a charter. The earliest charter that survives in the records is from 1497, when the Lord of Glamorgan was Thomas le Dispenser, and it grants and confirms the rights and privileges of the burgesses of Kenfig in the careful, elaborate language of medieval legal Latin. You can still see this charter today in the Glamorgan Record Office in Cardiff. It is kept in a folder tied with ribbon, with its original seal still attached, and it carries the slightly unreal quality that all very old documents have, the sense that what you are looking at is a physical object that has survived everything, while most of the world it described has not. The charter gave the burgesses considerable rights. The right to make bylaws, the right to raise taxes within the borough, the right to hold markets and fairs, the right to run their own local courts for many kinds of disputes. These were not trivial privileges. They represented a degree of self-governance and legal autonomy that was genuinely valuable in the medieval world, where the lord's word was usually absolute, and the peasant's legal recourse was essentially non-existent. The people who held burgess status in Kenfig were not peasants. They were the medieval equivalent of property-owning townspeople, craftsmen, merchants, traders, skilled workers. They held burgages, which were plots of land within the town boundary on standardized terms. They owed rents and certain services to the lord, but they were not serfs, not unfree labourers bound to the land. They could sell their burgage plots. They could leave the town.
They had standing before the law in a way that agricultural peasants did not. The town itself was laid out with some degree of planning, as Norman boroughs typically were. The castle stood at the northern end, commanding the river crossing. To the south, the town spread along a street plan that included burgage plots fronting onto the main street or streets, each plot long and narrow in the classic medieval pattern, with the house at the front and a yard and garden and possibly outbuildings behind. The total enclosed area of the town, protected by a bank and ditch, was approximately 8 hectares. Not enormous, but substantial enough to house several hundred people and all the commercial and social infrastructure they required.
There were at least 2 churches serving Kenfig. The principal one was the Church of St. James, which stood within or close to the town. This church served as the spiritual centre of the community, the place where baptisms and marriages and funerals were conducted, where the population gathered on Sundays and feast days, where the year was marked and measured in the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. Medieval churches were not merely places of worship in the modern sense. They were the public centres of community life. The churchyard was the town's primary burial ground, a physical record of generations of Kenfig residents laid into the soil. But the institutions of medieval Kenfig extended well beyond the church. There was a guild hall, which served as the administrative centre for the borough's governance, the place where the burgesses met to make decisions, settle disputes, and conduct the formal business of town life. The existence of a guild hall in a settlement of this size is significant. It suggests a community substantial enough and organised enough to need dedicated civic architecture. This was not a hamlet. This was a functioning town with recognisable urban institutions. There was also a hospital. The records indicate a hospital functioning in Kenfig at its height, which is a remarkable thing to find in a medieval settlement of this scale in this particular part of Wales. Medieval hospitals were not hospitals in the modern surgical and medical sense. They were more like what we might call almshouses or hospices, places of refuge and care for the sick, the poor, the elderly, and travellers in need. They were usually run by a religious order or under the supervision of the church. The existence of one at Kenfig speaks to a community prosperous and organised enough to maintain this kind of institution. It suggests merchants, wool traders, travellers coming through on business. It suggests commerce. It suggests a town that was genuinely part of the wider economic world of medieval Britain. The market was the economic heartbeat of the borough. Medieval towns existed in large part to facilitate trade, and the market, held on a regular day each week, sometimes more frequently, was where the agricultural surplus of the surrounding countryside came to meet the manufactured goods and imported commodities of the town. Farmers bought grain and livestock and wool. Craftsmen bought leather goods and ironwork and pottery. Merchants bought cloth
and spices and whatever luxuries the local population could afford. The lord of the manor took a cut of all of this in the form of tolls and fees, which was one of the primary reasons Norman lords encouraged the establishment of boroughs in the first place.
The sounds and smells of a medieval market day in Kenfig would have been overwhelming by modern standards of quiet and order. Livestock lowed and bleated from the animal pens at the edge of the market area. Sellers called out their prices and the quality of their goods in the overlapping cacophony that characterizes any open-air market across any culture and any period. The smiths and metalworkers who had stalls on the market had to shout louder than most. The smell of animals mixed with the smell of fresh bread from the bakers, with the sharp reek of tallow candles, with the salt wind coming constantly from the channel to the south, with the smoke of cooking fires, and the less appealing smells of the middens and privies that were an unavoidable feature of medieval urban life. Children would have been everywhere, as they always are in market settings, running errands, trying to steal things, watching the entertainers, if there were any, a juggler passing through, or a trained animal, or a performer of some kind who had found that the weekly market day brought enough of a crowd to be worth performing for. The market was the one day of the week when the town's population was temporarily swelled by all the people from the surrounding countryside who came in to trade, so it was also the day when news was shared and gossip spread and old acquaintances were renewed and feuds were conducted in the form of pointed ignoring of each other across the market square. The legal and administrative life of the borough ran in parallel with the commercial life. The borough court met regularly to hear disputes, the kinds of disputes that arise in any small, dense community where people's lives are physically close and their economic interests constantly overlapping. Property boundaries, unpaid debts, accusations of selling underweight bread or watered ale, fights that had escalated beyond the socially acceptable. The court records, where they survive from other medieval boroughs of similar type, give an extraordinarily vivid picture of the texture of daily life, in a way that more formal historical sources simply do not. The Kenfig court records have not survived, or at least have not yet been found, but their absence does not mean the disputes did not happen. They happened everywhere. They always happen. Kenfig's position on the Bristol Channel was genuinely advantageous for trade. The Channel had been a busy maritime corridor since before the Romans. Ships moved back and forth between Wales and Somerset and Devon and Cornwall, and via longer routes to France and Ireland and Iberia. A borough with access to the Channel could participate in this seaborne trade. There is evidence of commercial connections between Kenfig and the wider network of medieval South Wales ports and markets. The pottery found in the archaeological record at Kenfig includes not just local wares, but material from outside the immediate area, the fingerprints of trade in ceramic form. The people who lived in this town had rules to follow. The borough records and charters include provisions for the regulation of trade that give a vivid glimpse into the daily concerns of medieval commercial life. There were laws about the quality of bread and beer,
the two staple products that were regulated almost everywhere in medieval England and Wales, because their quality was of immediate concern to everyone. Weights and measures were controlled, because false weights were a persistent problem in medieval markets, and the kind of thing that could turn a busy market day into a brawl very quickly. There were regulations about noise, about where animals could be kept, about the obligations of burgesses to maintain the town's defences. Because Kenfig needed defending, constantly, relentlessly. The Welsh were not going to accept this Norman intrusion into their territory without response, and the history of Kenfig for the first 2 centuries of its existence is, to a significant degree, a history of attack and retaliation, burning and rebuilding, raid and recovery. Which brings us to the chapter of Kenfig's story that in some ways makes everything that followed feel both inevitable and slightly miraculous. The town survived everything the Welsh could throw at it, and in the end, it was not the Welsh who destroyed it. It was the sand. Section 5. Fire and Blood. The Welsh Raids.
If you were a Norman lord in 12th century Glamorgan, you knew that your Welsh neighbours were never entirely reconciled to your presence. This was not paranoia, it was geopolitics. The Norman settlement of Glamorgan had been achieved by military force, maintained by the threat of military force, and every Norman castle in the region stood as a daily physical reminder that someone had taken something. The Welsh princes and lords who held the lands immediately west of the Norman frontier had not given up their claims. They had merely, temporarily and under duress, ceased pressing them overtly. Kenfig, sitting right on the frontier, right on the edge of the Welsh lordship of Avan, was a perpetual target. The historical record is remarkably consistent on this point. The castle and town were attacked, sacked, and burned at various points in their history, somewhere between 6 and 8 times, depending on which incidents you count and how seriously you take some of the less well-documented accounts. It was attacked and damaged so repeatedly that the phrase burned down in the context of Kenfig begins to feel almost routine, like a weather report. The attacks came from various directions, and for various reasons, but the Welsh lords of Avan were the most persistent aggressors. Morgan Gam, Morgan the Crooked, a nickname that hints at either physical appearance or political character, possibly both, is particularly associated with attacks on Kenfig in the 13th century. The Avan lords had every reason to resent the Norman borough on their doorstep. It represented not just military threat, but economic competition. The market at Kenfig drew trade that might otherwise have gone to Welsh settlements. The borough's privileges and legal framework were explicitly English and Norman in origin, a daily assertion of a different and competing civilization planted in Welsh soil. The attacks were serious. We are not talking about cattle raids or skirmishes. We are talking about forces large enough to breach the town's defences, put buildings to the torch, kill or drive off the inhabitants, and leave the settlement in sufficient ruin that significant rebuilding was required afterward.
One can imagine the appearance of smoke on the horizon, the alarm spreading through the town, people grabbing children and valuables and running for the castle or the road, the smell of burning timber, the castle gates pulled shut, the waiting, and then, each time, the rebuilding. This is the part of Kenfig's early history that I find genuinely remarkable. The town was burned and it was rebuilt. Burned again and rebuilt again. The people who did this rebuilding were by any measure stubborn. Or perhaps they had no choice. The Lord of Glamorgan needed his frontier borough. The burgesses needed their market rights and their legal privileges. The merchants needed the trade routes. Everyone had an interest in Kenfig continuing to exist, and so it continued to exist, despite everything.
By the early 14th century, the castle had been substantially rebuilt in stone. The ramparts were removed and replaced with a proper curtain wall. A large gatehouse was erected, with the tower itself substantially reconstructed. The bailey was reorganised, and the whole site given a more permanent, confident character. The investment of money and labour this represented suggests that around 1300, the lords of Glamorgan still believed in Kenfig as a going concern, still believed it was worth defending, still believed that the frontier position, despite all the trouble and expense it entailed, was strategically and commercially valuable. Llewellyn the Great, Llewellyn ap Iorwerth, the most powerful Welsh prince of the 13th century, had a go at this part of Glamorgan during the wider Welsh resistance of his era, leaving havoc in his wake through various Norman settlements. Kenfig's records place it among the settlements that suffered during these periods of large-scale Welsh military action. And then, in the early 15th century, came Owain Glyndwr. The great Welsh uprising that Owain led between approximately 1400 and 1415 was the last serious large-scale attempt to drive the English and Norman establishment out of Wales, and it was formidable. Owain Glyndwr was not a frontier raider. He was a nobleman of genuine political sophistication, who built alliances with France and Scotland, who established something resembling a Welsh parliament at Machynlleth, who at one point controlled most of Wales. His forces reached South Wales and swept through the Norman boroughs. Kenfig was among the settlements that his rebellion damaged.
Each of these attacks was a catastrophe in the immediate term. Houses burned, people died or fled. The market fell silent. The guild hall stood empty. The church, if it survived, would have seen a surge of frightened, grieving people in the days after an attack. And then, slowly, determinedly, with the collective stubbornness that characterizes communities that have decided they belong somewhere, the town picked itself up and started again. There is something quietly heroic about this pattern, looked at from the outside. These were ordinary people, craftsmen and traders and farmers and innkeepers and priests and children. They were not warriors, mostly. They were people who had chosen to live in a dangerous place because the opportunities it offered, the market rights, the burgess status, the access to trade, the relative legal autonomy, were worth the risk.
and each time the risk materialized in the most violent possible way, they rebuilt. They would need every bit of that stubbornness for what was coming next, because the next enemy was not a Welsh prince with an army. It was the wind, and the wind was patient in a way that no army ever is. Section 6. The dunes begin to move. Nature's first warning.
The dune system along the Glamorgan coast is not a fixed thing. It never has been. Dunes are, by their nature, in motion, a slow, wind-powered migration of granular material across the landscape, advancing and retreating, growing and shrinking, burying and revealing things as they go. Understanding what happened to Kenfig requires understanding something about how coastal dune systems work, because the process that swallowed the town was not random. It was the result of specific environmental conditions that came together over centuries into something the medieval inhabitants of Kenfig had no framework to predict or manage. Sand dunes form wherever wind blows sand on shore, and something, a tuft of grass, a piece of driftwood, any small obstacle, causes the wind to slow and drop its load. The sand accumulates around the obstacle grows, more sand accumulates, the dune grows taller and wider. Eventually, the dune is large enough to have its own wind shadow, its own microclimate on the lee side, and the grass Ammophila arenaria, marram grass, with its deep spreading root systems, colonizes the surface and holds the sand together. A stable dune forms. But dunes are not permanently stable. They are always responding to wind direction and force, to the supply of sand from the beach, to rainfall and drought. Under the right conditions, sustained onshore winds, abundant sand supply, weakened vegetation from drought or overgrazing, dunes can become mobile. They can begin to advance. Not quickly in human terms, a few meters a year perhaps, sometimes less, but relentless. The advancing face of a moving dune overwhelms whatever is in front of it with the casual thoroughness of something that has no agenda and makes no exceptions. The coastal geomorphology of the Glamorgan coastline was, from the beginning, not entirely favourable to the survival of Kenfig. The Bristol Channel, into which the river Kenfig drains, is one of the most energetically tidal bodies of water in the world. It has the second highest tidal range on Earth after the Bay of Fundy in Canada. The tides here rise and fall by enormous amounts, in some places over 15 meters between low and high tide. All that moving water carries sediment. All that moving water works on the coast with extraordinary force. The beach at Kenfig, during big storms and high tides, was not a comfortable place. The supply of sand to the dune system had been ongoing for centuries, building the great spread of dunes that today constitutes Kenfig boroughs. But for much of the medieval period, the dune system was probably relatively stable, colonized by vegetation, held in place by plant roots, not advancing significantly. There is evidence from historical sources and from the archaeology itself that Kenfig town and the dune system coexisted
without major conflict for the first century or so of the borough's existence. The sand was there, but it was behaving itself. The first hints of trouble come in the 13th century. There are references in historical documents from this period to sand encroachment, to sand blowing into places where it had not been before, to agricultural land becoming less productive because of drifting sand. These are early warning signs, visible in retrospect, that the dune system was becoming less stable, that the wind had found its way into the balance of things.
Modern research by coastal geomorphologists and archaeologists working in this area has shed some light on what may have triggered the destabilization. Climate patterns in the medieval period were not uniform. The medieval warm period, which broadly ran from about 950 to 1250 CE, was followed by a transition toward cooler, stormier conditions in the 13th and 14th centuries. More storms meant more energy in the coastal system. More storm waves meant more sand thrown up onto the beaches. More wind meant more sand thrown further inland. The vegetation covering the older, established dunes could not keep pace with the rate of new sand burial, and as it died back, the dunes began to move. This was not, it must be said, unique to Kenfig. The whole coast of Wales experienced significant episodes of dune advance in the later medieval period. Communities at Newborough Warren on Anglesey, at several sites along Cardigan Bay, and at other points along the South Wales coast were all affected by expanding sand systems during this period. Kenfig was part of a wider pattern of coastal transformation that was reshaping the margins of the island. But at Kenfig, the combination of an already substantial dune system lying directly to the southwest of the town, exactly the direction of the prevailing winds, and the vulnerability of the town's location right at the edge of the coastal zone, made the consequences more severe than almost anywhere else in Wales. What happened next would be slow, and then terrible, and then final. Section 7. The Great Storms, a town under siege by sand. The accounts of what happened at Kenfig from the early 14th century onwards read, in retrospect, like the slow chapters of a novel, where you can see the disaster coming long before the characters can. A series of great storms beginning around the year 1300. Long periods of sustained drifting that followed. Sand finding its way into places it had never been before. Fields becoming infertile. Gardens filling with sand. The streets acquiring a new texture, a new sound, a new inconvenience that never quite went away. Consider for a moment what it would have meant to be the Lord Steward in Kenfig in the early decades of the 14th century. Your job was to manage the finances and administration of the borough. You kept the accounts, you collected the rents, you noted in the ledger columns which burgesses were in arrears and which had paid on time. And over the years of your tenure, you would have watched the numbers change in ways that could not be explained by the normal fluctuations of trade and weather. Fewer active burgesses paying rent each year. Agricultural assessments showing declining yields in the fields to the west and southwest. Requests from individual burgesses for rent reductions or remissions on the grounds that their property was no longer productive.
the language of the ledger would not have been dramatic. Ledgers are never dramatic, but the story it told was.
To the inhabitants themselves, the change would have been both gradual and, in specific storm events, suddenly acute. The great storms of the late 13th and early 14th centuries were not unique to Kenfig. Historical climatology suggests that this period saw an increase in storm frequency and intensity across northwest Europe, associated with the broader shift away from the relatively benign conditions of the medieval warm period toward the cooler, stormier conditions of the Little Ice Age. The coasts of England, Wales, and the Low Countries all show evidence of significant coastal change and storm damage in this period. Kenfig was not uniquely unlucky. It was simply more exposed, more vulnerable, and sitting directly in the path of the dominant wind direction than most. Imagine what this would have felt like as a daily experience. You wake one morning after a night of strong southwesterly winds, the kind of winds that come off the Atlantic and build across the Bristol Channel until they hit the Welsh coast with all the accumulated force of that long fetch of open water. And there is sand on your windowsill. There is sand on the floor inside the door because the wind found the gap at the bottom. There is sand in the well, which is annoying because you have to let the sediment settle before the water is drinkable. The street outside has a new drift of sand along one wall, thigh high, that was not there yesterday. You sweep it out. You clear the drift. You go about your day. It happens again next week, and the week after. And by midwinter, the drift against the wall is chest high, and you have been sweeping and clearing for months, and still it comes. And in the spring, when you go to plough the field on the western side of town, the one that has always been your most productive, you find that a good third of it is buried under 1/2 metre of compacted sand, and the grass that grew there is dead. This is how it begins, not with catastrophe, but with inconvenience, with the gradual, grinding accumulation of sand in places where sand should not be. The accumulation that over years and then decades rises from inconvenience to serious problem, to existential threat. The storms of the early 14th century are the pivot point in Kenfig's history. What had been a manageable, if irritating, encroachment became, after a succession of major storm events, something qualitatively different. The great dune ridges to the southwest of the town, which had been more or less stable, began to move. They had absorbed so much new sand from successive storms, their vegetation cover had been so thoroughly overwhelmed that they were now advancing into the settled landscape like a slow-motion wall. Not meters per year, perhaps, maybe less than that in calm periods, but in a bad storm season, significantly more. The historical record for this period at Kenfig is not dense. We do not have day-by-day accounts or letters from residents describing what they were experiencing. What we have are references in administrative records, in church documents, in the records of the borough court, that begin to show the strain. Appeals for tax relief, references to land lost, the gradual decline in the number of active burgesses recorded in borough records, which tells you that people were leaving without actually spelling out why. 14th century Kenfig was also dealing, remember, with all the other catastrophes of that catastrophic century. The Black Death arrived in Britain in 1348 and moved through the population with devastating speed. In some areas, it killed between a third and a half of the population in its first outbreak. A settlement the size of Kenfig, already under pressure from the sand, losing a significant portion of its population to plague, suddenly had far fewer hands available to fight the encroachment, fewer people to sweep the sand from the streets, fewer people to repair the banks and ditches that might have slowed the dune advance. The two disasters, environmental and epidemiological, intersected in the worst possible way. And then Owain Glyndwr's uprising in the early 15th century added another layer of disruption. Kenfig, already damaged by sand, already reduced in population by plague and emigration, already struggling to maintain its infrastructure, was damaged again by the rebellion. Each disruption made the next one harder to recover from. The resilience that had rebuilt the town after each Welsh raid, the stubborn communal determination that had relit the market fires and reopened the Guildhall, was being worn down. The town was tired. By the middle of the 15th century, the sand was not just encroaching at the edges, it was advancing through the town itself. Houses were being abandoned, not because they had been burned or damaged, but because the owners simply could not keep up with the sand anymore. It piled against walls, it blocked doorways, it covered gardens completely. It began to filter through gaps in walls, through the spaces between the stones, slowly filling interior rooms from the ground up. The phrase that archaeologists use when they discuss the stratigraphy of Kenfig, wind-blown sand burial layers, tells you exactly what happened. The sand came down from above, from outside, and buried things exactly where they were. This is what makes the preservation so extraordinary. These were not objects that fell and were trampled and kicked around and eventually broken up and scattered in the way that things usually are at abandoned settlements. These were objects that were simply covered, left where they were and covered over by successive layers of clean, dry, preserving sand as the dune advanced through the site. A pot in a kitchen, a coin dropped in the street, the foundations of a wall with a destruction layer of charcoal from a fire below, and above the fire layer a deep sequence of clean sand. Everything sealed, everything waiting. For 600 years. Section 8. A town surrenders for slow abandonment. There is no single date for the abandonment of Kenfig. No record of a council meeting at which it was decided that the town was finished, that it was time to go. No dramatic exodus, no final battle, no symbolic last stand. Just a gradual emptying spread over decades as one family after another reached the point at which the difficulty and cost and sheer endless labour of living in a sand-invaded town outweighed whatever was keeping them there. The process is visible in retrospect in the records. The number of active burgesses, those paying rents and exercising their rights in the borough courts, declined steadily through the 15th century. Each decade brought fewer names onto the lists. Some families moved to nearby settlements. Some went to Bridgend, a few miles to the east. Some went further. The merchants and craftsmen who had given the borough its commercial life relocated to places where trade was still possible, where the roads were not drifting shut, where customers could actually reach them. The Church of St. James, the town's principal church, was one of the last functioning institutions of the original borough. The congregation shrank as the town emptied, but the church continued to serve whoever remained. Before 1485, the decision was made to build a new church at Pyle, a village a mile or so inland, and to transfer the parish functions there. This was a significant step. The relocation of the church is, in a very real sense, the relocation of the community itself. The church is where you baptize your children, where you marry, where you bury your dead. Moving the church means accepting, formally and officially, that the old location is no longer viable. It means accepting, with all the grief and disruption that implies, that the place you or your parents or your grandparents called home is gone. The earliest surviving charter of Kenfig, dated 1397, is from relatively late in the town's functional life. It was issued by Thomas le Dispenser, and it confirms and grants the rights of the burgesses in careful formal language. The fact that such a charter was issued at this date suggests that someone, somewhere in the administrative chain, still believed the borough was worth maintaining, still believed it had a future, still thought it was worth the cost of the legal ceremony and the attached seal and the careful folding and storing of the document. But Thomas le Dispenser was executed in 1400, caught on the wrong side of politics, and his property was confiscated. Kenfig passed to his widow, Constance, and then into the complicated succession of the lordship of Glamorgan that followed.
By the mid-15th century, the problem of sand was so severe that it had become the dominant fact of life in Kenfig. The castle walls were being undermined by sand accumulating against their base. The dunes had advanced to the point where they were burying buildings from the outside. Farming in the immediate vicinity of the town was essentially impossible. The road connections that had made the borough commercially viable were becoming choked and unreliable. The town that Robert, Earl of Gloucester, had planted here 300 years before to control a river crossing and project Norman authority into the Welsh borderlands, had become, slowly and irreversibly, a sand trap. The very last formal records of Kenfig as an active borough stretch into the late 15th century, but they describe a community that is a shadow of its former self. A handful of burgesses, still meeting, still going through the formal motions of the borough's legal and administrative life, but doing so in a settlement that was, by this point, more sand dune than town. The castle had been abandoned, its upper levels already buried, the garrison long gone. The Guildhall was silent, the hospital was gone. The market that had drawn traders from across the region existed only in memory. And then came John Leland, the antiquary and traveller, making his tour of England and Wales in the late 1530s on behalf of Henry VIII, recording what he saw with a mixture of historical curiosity and practical observation. He came to Kenfig and he wrote what he saw. There is a little village on the east side of Kenfig, he recorded, and a castle, both in ruin and almost choked and devoured with the sands that the Severn Sea casteth up.
Almost choked, almost devoured. As of 1539, there was still a little village at the site, still a few people maintaining some residual presence. But the language of Leland's account is unmistakably the language of ending, of a thing in its final stages. The sand has won. The town has lost. The process that began with storms around 1300 has, over the course of 2.5 centuries, completed its slow work. The castle is in ruin. The medieval borough, once the dominant settlement on this frontier, once prosperous enough to maintain a hospital and a guild hall and 2 churches, is almost choked. Within a generation or 2 of Leland's visit, even the little village at the site was gone. What remained was sand, dunes, the very top of a castle keep, and silence. Section 9. The Pool and its Legends. Kenfig's Drowned Mythology. Kenfig Pool sits, dark and still, in the hollow of the dunes, and it has been generating legends for as long as anyone can remember. A stretch of water roughly 2 kilometres long and 1 kilometre wide, dark with tannins, reflecting the sky in tones of pewter and charcoal, surrounded on almost all sides by the rolling humps of the sand dune system. It is exactly the kind of place that accumulates stories, the way the dunes accumulate sand.
The most persistent legend, and the one that most directly concerns the buried town, is the claim that Kenfig Pool contains not just water, but a whole drowned settlement beneath its surface. That the original town of Kenfig, or at least part of it, lies submerged below the pool's dark waters. That if you were to drain the pool, you would find streets and buildings and the ruins of medieval life on the lake bed. This legend has a long and vivid history in the folklore of the area. According to one version of the story, an earthquake caused the land to sink and fill with water, creating the pool in a single catastrophic moment, swallowing the town in an instant. This is dramatic, satisfying, and almost certainly not what happened. Modern geological and geomorphological research suggests a much less dramatic, but ultimately more interesting origin for the pool. Before the sand advanced and changed the hydrology of the area,
The river Kenfig ran south toward the coast through a relatively open landscape. As the dunes advanced and expanded, they blocked the river's drainage to the sea. The water backed up. What had been marshy ground became a lake. The pool is, in essence, a river that the dunes trapped. A historical document from the year 1360 refers to a stream called the Black Lough flowing along the western side of the buried Kenfig town. Researchers believe this Black Lough was an early outlet or overflow channel associated with what would become the pool. The pool was forming slowly as the dunes expanded and redirected the drainage during the same period that the town was being engulfed.
The historical reality that the town does not lie beneath the pool, but beside it, buried under the dunes to the north, is slightly less dramatic than the legend, but arguably more interesting. Archaeology and history confirm that the town and the pool existed simultaneously, side by side, as the dunes advanced. The pool is what the river became when the sand blocked its way. The town is what the borough became when the sand blocked its streets. But legends are not really about geographical accuracy. Legends are about emotional truth. And the emotional truth that the Kenfig legend captures very precisely is the sense of something vast and significant having vanished. The pool is where the vanished thing went. In the folk imagination, the lake is the repository of the lost town. If you row out onto it and peer into the dark water, you might see on a very clear day the shadows of walls and towers beneath the surface. You might hear on still nights the sound of church bells ringing underwater, the bells of the submerged church calling a congregation that will never come. The folklore around the pool extends beyond the simple drowned town motif. There was said to be a whirlpool in the southwest corner of the pool, called the Black Gutter, that dragged boaters and swimmers to their deaths. The pool was said to be bottomless. It is, in fact, about 12 feet deep. The number of springs feeding it was traditionally given as 7, a number with deep folkloric resonance across Celtic tradition, though the springs are believed to have dried up now, and the actual hydrology of the pool is supplied by the trapped river water and local drainage. There is also the legend of the Lord's Daughter, one of those timeless folk tales that attaches itself to romantic landscapes and bodies of water all across the Celtic world. According to this story, the daughter of the Lord of Kenfig fell in love with a young man of humble birth and no property. Her father, naturally, refused to countenance the match. The young man, desperate and determined, left Kenfig to seek his fortune elsewhere, hoping to return wealthy enough to be considered acceptable. He was away for many years. When he finally came back, having achieved some measure of success, he found that the girl he loved had been given in marriage to someone else and had died of grief and longing. He drowned himself in the pool. On certain nights, according to the legend, you can still see the two of them walking together on the surface of the water, finally reunited in the only place left to them. There is something deeply human about this.
about the way a community that has lost its home translates that loss into story. The town is gone, then it lives under the water. The young lovers were separated, then they walk on the pool. Loss is intolerable in its raw form, and folklore is one of the ways that human communities make it bearable. By giving the loss a shape, a story, a set of images that can be passed down and retold, the community preserves not just the fact of what happened, but the feeling of it. The grief of abandonment, the sense of a world gone under, survives in the legend of the drowned town long after the last person who actually lived there is dust. Section 10. Centuries of Silence. The Buried Years.
After Leland's account in 1539, the historical record of Kenfig goes quiet for a long time. Not entirely quiet. There are occasional references in county histories and travellers' accounts that mention the buried town, usually with a note of romantic melancholy or antiquarian curiosity. But the active day-to-day documentary record that a functioning town generates, court rolls, tax returns, market records, church registers, that record has simply ended. The dunes continued to advance and consolidate through the 16th and 17th centuries. What little had remained visible of the town was gradually buried deeper. The castle, by this point, would have had only its very topmost course of stonework breaking the surface, a lonely stub of masonry in a landscape of grass-covered dunes that no longer gave any outward sign of what lay beneath. To someone passing through who did not know the history, it would have looked like nothing in particular. A slightly odd protrusion in the dune grass, a curiosity. The pool continued to exist, as pools do, indifferent to the drama of its origin. It became a place for fishing, and records from the later medieval and early modern periods mention fish being taken from it. The nature reserve around it, though it would not be formally designated as such for centuries, was already developing its characteristic ecology. The dune slacks where the rare plants grow, the reed beds at the pool's edge, the grassland habitats of the older stabilized dunes. Occasional storms, particularly severe ones, would temporarily expose sections of the buried town. A winter storm that scoured deeply into the dune face might reveal a section of wall, a stretch of paved surface, a heap of medieval pottery fragments. There are accounts, growing from the 17th century onward, of local people finding things in the sand after storms. Coins, pottery, objects that did not seem to belong to any living settlement. These finds fed the local folklore of the buried town, gave the legend a physical dimension, a set of tangible objects that could be held in the hand as evidence that something real lay beneath. An early account from 1666 mentions that the ruins of Kenfig and its castle were wholly covered and swallowed up in the sand, with only the top of the keep visible. By this point, the town had been buried for the better part of 2 centuries, and the cultural memory of it had passed from living tradition into the realm of local legend
and antiquarian curiosity. The 18th century saw the first serious attempts to document the site, as the growing antiquarian movement of that period turned its attention to the physical remnants of the medieval world. John Speed's historic maps had included references to Kenfig earlier. Various county histories mentioned the buried town, with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. The mixture of genuine historical record and folklore that surrounded Kenfig began, slowly, to attract the attention of people who were interested in disentangling the two.
By the 19th century, the site was well known enough in antiquarian circles to have generated a small literature of its own. Local historians wrote about it. The Cambrian Archaeological Association, established in 1847 to promote the study of Welsh antiquities, had the buried borough on its radar. The combination of a well-documented medieval history, a dramatic physical preservation, and a layer of compelling folklore made Kenfig exactly the kind of site that Victorian antiquarians found irresistible. And yet, for all the interest, for all the writing and the legends, and the occasional finds washing out of the dune face after storms, the systematic excavation of Kenfig did not begin until the 20th century. The sand guarded its treasure patiently for 400 years after Leland wrote his epitaph. What it held was waiting, as things buried in the dark always do, for someone with the curiosity and the tools and the commitment to come and find it. Section 11. The First Dig. Arthur Richards and the 1920s excavation. The first serious archaeological investigation of the buried borough of Kenfig was led, appropriately enough, by a schoolmaster. Arthur J. Richards was a teacher at a school in Port Talbot, the industrial town that sits just to the south and east of the Kenfig site, and he was, by all accounts, a man of considerable local historical enthusiasm. In the 1920s, Richards organised and led the first substantial excavations at the Kenfig castle site, and what he found justified every hour of the considerable effort involved. The excavations in the 1920s and early 1930s cleared a significant amount of sand from around and within the castle remains. What emerged was remarkable. The castle keep, that stubborn protrusion of Norman masonry that Leland had noted, and that had been poking above the sand ever since, turned out to be the visible tip of something much more substantial. Below the surface, the castle walls were in far better condition than anyone had dared to hope. The stone, sealed from the air and from frost action by the covering sand, had not deteriorated in the way that exposed masonry does over centuries. The mortar, protected from rain and freeze-thaw cycles, was still hard and intact in many sections. Richards documented the gatehouse foundations. The curtain wall lines were traced, confirming the shape of the defended enclosure. The extent of the bailey was mapped. What emerged was a clear picture of a properly fortified medieval castle, not large by the standards of the great Welsh fortresses, but substantial and well organised, with all the components you would expect: the keep, the gatehouse, the surrounding curtain wall,
the ditched enclosure. The scale of the square keep, approximately 50 feet across, was confirmed. The finds from the Richards excavations included pottery and structural evidence that helped fix the chronology of the castle's development. The masonry work showed clearly the different phases of construction that the documentary record describes: the early Norman build, the subsequent modifications, the major rebuilding of the early 14th century. The physical archaeology and the written history confirmed each other in the satisfying way that good archaeology does.
But the excavations had a problem. A fundamental, inescapable, sand-based problem. For every load of sand that was removed from around the castle remains, more was ready to move back in. The dune system of Kenfig burrows is not static. The sand is always moving, always blowing, always finding its way into any gap that is opened up. Within years of the Richards excavations, the sand had re-invaded. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the exposed castle ruins were being buried again. What had been carefully cleared and documented was disappearing back under the dunes. Only the very top of the keep remained above the surface. This is the challenge that makes Kenfig different from almost every other archaeological site. At most sites, once you excavate, the excavated area stays clear. You can come back years later and see the same walls and floors and features that you uncovered the first time. At Kenfig, the sand simply comes back. Any excavation is by nature temporary. You open a window into the buried town, look through it, document what you see, and then the window closes again. The sand never stops moving. The town never stops being buried. Richard's work was important nonetheless. It produced the first systematic documentation of the castle remains. It was written up in the journal Archaeologia Cambrensis in 1925, making the findings available to the wider archaeological community. And it established definitively that what lay beneath the dunes was not just legend, but physical reality. That the buried burrow of Kenfig was genuinely there, genuinely substantial, and genuinely preserving evidence of medieval life in extraordinary condition. The challenge for subsequent generations of archaeologists would be to find a way of working with the sand rather than against it, of taking advantage of the moments when the dunes naturally exposed sections of the buried town, and of developing excavation strategies that could extract maximum information in minimum time before the sand returned. That challenge would eventually produce the Kenfig Society, and 12 years of some of the most productive and painstaking archaeological work ever done in South Wales. Section 12. The Kenfig Society and Modern Archaeology. The Kenfig Society was formed by local people with a serious commitment to understanding and preserving the heritage of the buried borough. From the 1980s onward, and continuing into the present, the Society has pursued a program of careful, systematic excavation at various points within the buried town.
working in the spaces between the dune crests, in the slacks and hollows where the sand is shallower and the buried town's remains are closer to the surface. Over the course of 12 years of active excavation work, what the Society uncovered rewrote the understanding of what Kenfig had actually looked like and how it had functioned. This was not the vague, legendary buried town of folklore. This was a real medieval settlement with identifiable streets, identifiable buildings, identifiable infrastructure, and a material culture of considerable richness.
The pottery finds alone tell a substantial story. The excavations recovered medieval pottery spanning several centuries of the town's occupation. The earliest pieces include veil-ware pottery from the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the ceramics associated with the first generation of Norman settlement in Glamorgan, handmade or partly wheel-thrown, with the rough, functional character of early medieval pottery. These pieces were being used by the first burgesses of Kenfig, the people who had responded to Robert, Earl of Gloucester's invitation to settle here in the mid-12th century. Later layers produced more refined ceramics, reflecting both improved pottery technology and the wider trade networks into which Kenfig was integrated. Among the finds recovered across the various excavations, 2 silver pennies of Henry III, dated to between 1248 and 1251, stand out as particularly evocative. These coins were current during the reign of a king who had been dead for nearly 800 years when they were found. They had been lost or dropped or discarded casually as you discard a penny today by someone going about their business in the streets of medieval Kenfig. And there they had been ever since, perfectly preserved in the sealed sand, waiting to be found. Hold that image for a moment. A medieval silver penny struck between 1248 and 1251, held in someone's hand in the market at Kenfig, used to buy bread perhaps, or a measure of ale, or a piece of leather, or a candle, dropped in the street without being noticed or recovered, covered over by 6 centuries of sand, and then recovered, bright as the day it was minted, by a member of the Kenfig Society gently brushing sand from around a buried surface. The structural evidence from the modern excavations is equally striking. The excavators found unmortared stone walls up to a metre wide, the building technique typical of vernacular medieval construction in this part of Wales, where dry stone walling or lightly mortared rubble walls were standard practice for ordinary buildings. These walls were in many cases still standing to considerable height, their uppermost courses right at the current surface of the dune, their lower courses extending down into the sealed burial layers. A metalled road surface was identified and documented, not just the vague trace of an old route, but an actual surfaced road, compacted stone and gravel laid deliberately to create a firm, drained surface for carts and horses and pedestrians. The road surface lay exactly where the historical and topographical logic suggested a main street of the medieval borough should be. You are standing on the street of a medieval town when you find something like that.
and the directness of that connection across 7 centuries is difficult to describe properly. A defensive ditch up to 2.5 meters deep was uncovered in sections, part of the bank and ditch system that surrounded the borough and protected it from attack. In the filling of the ditch, the archaeologists found the charcoal-rich destruction layers that speak to the periods when the town was attacked and burned. Fire layers clearly visible in the stratigraphy, representing specific historical events, specific nights when Kenfig was in flames. Above those destruction layers, clean wind-blown sand, representing the periods after the fire when the sand advanced over the ruins. The stratigraphy is a sequence of events written in earth and charcoal and sand, legible to those who know how to read it.
Time Team, the long-running British television programme that brought archaeological excavation to a popular audience, visited Kenfig and excavated sections of the buried town, bringing the story of the buried borough to a much wider public. The programme's episode on Kenfig, with its characteristic 3-day excavation format and the combination of expert commentary and enthusiastic presentation, introduced many people to a site that had previously been known only to specialists and local historians. What the modern archaeology confirms, repeatedly and emphatically, is that the deposits beneath the dunes of Kenfig burrows are largely intact. The depth of burial, varying between a few centimetres in some places and up to 30 metres in others, has created a sealed archive of medieval life that has been barely touched. The Kenfig Society's 12 years of excavation have, by the Society's own estimate, barely pricked the surface. The vast majority of the buried borough remains exactly as it was when the last resident left and the sand covered the final doorway. Somewhere down there, the full extent of the medieval street plan lies undisturbed. The foundations of the Guildhall, the footprint of the hospital, the outlines of hundreds of burgage plots with their gardens and outbuildings, and the accumulated material of daily life. A medieval town preserved at a level of completeness that is, anywhere in Britain, almost without parallel. Section 13. What the sand kept. The science of preservation. The reason Kenfig is compared to Pompeii is not just the dramatic nature of its burial, but the quality of the preservation that burial has produced. And understanding why the sand has preserved things so well requires a brief consideration of what preservation actually means in archaeological terms, and why most things do not get preserved at all. The default condition of organic material, wood, leather, textile, bone, plant matter, in most soil conditions is decay. Bacteria and fungi break down organic molecules. Oxygen drives oxidation. Water cycles of wetting and drying, freezing and thawing, stress and release the physical structure of objects until they fragment. The archaeological record is therefore, in most places, heavily biased toward inorganic materials. Stone, ceramic, glass, metal in stable form, these survive. Almost everything else does not. Preservation happens in conditions that prevent or slow decay.
Extreme cold slows bacterial action, which is why frozen permafrost sites can yield extraordinary organic preservation. Extreme desiccation, total dryness, prevents the water-dependent processes of decay, which is why the dry sands of Egypt preserved linen and wood and food for thousands of years. Waterlogging, counterintuitively, also preserves by excluding oxygen, creating anaerobic conditions in which the bacteria that cause decay cannot function. Peat bogs are the most famous example. The bog bodies of northern Europe, preserved for thousands of years, with their skin and hair and stomach contents intact, owe their survival to the oxygen-poor, acid environment of the waterlogged peat. Sand burial is a form of desiccation preservation. Dry, compacted sand excludes most of the water and much of the oxygen from the material it covers. Bacterial action slows dramatically. Physical disturbance is eliminated. There are no ploughs cutting through the layers, no building work smashing through the stratigraphy, no burrowing animals redistributing the contents. The material just sits there, in the dark, in the dry, in the still, while the centuries pass overhead.
The silver pennies of Henry III are the most immediately vivid illustration of this. Medieval silver corrodes in normal soil conditions, developing a patchy tarnish that over centuries can obscure the design and eventually destroy the metal altogether. The Kenfig pennies were found in a condition suggesting minimal corrosion. The sand had kept them clean and dry and undisturbed. The pottery, too, survives in notably good condition, not just scattered sherds, the kind of fragmentary material you find at most medieval sites, but substantial portions of vessels, some nearly complete, preserved in the positions where they were deposited. The structural evidence benefits from the same protection. Stone walls sealed beneath sand do not suffer from the frost action that causes exposed masonry to crumble. The face of a stone in the open loses material every winter as water penetrates the pores, freezes, expands, and forces fragments loose. A stone sealed beneath sand since the 15th century has not experienced this process once. The surface detail on the masonry from Kenfig excavations is reportedly remarkably crisp, the tooling marks of medieval masons still clearly visible on stones that have not seen daylight in 6 centuries. The depth of burial at Kenfig varies dramatically across the site, and this variation matters for understanding what might still be recoverable. In the areas closest to the active dune crests, where the sand has been most deeply deposited, 30 metres or more of compacted material presses down on the medieval surfaces. These areas are deeply and securely preserved, but also, for practical purposes, essentially inaccessible with current technology. The weight of 30 metres of sand alone is extraordinary. Excavating to that depth across any meaningful area would require engineering on a scale that is simply not feasible. In the hollows and slacks between the dune ridges, however, the buried town is much closer to the surface. In some areas, a metre or less of sand separates the modern ground surface from medieval floors and walls. These are the areas that storms and wind erosion naturally expose, and these are the areas where the Kenfig Society and other archaeological teams have focused their work. The shallowly buried sections offer the best combination of accessibility and preservation.
The comparison with Pompeii is instructive, but also has its limits. Pompeii was preserved by a single catastrophic event, the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, that covered the city almost instantly in meters of volcanic ash and pumice, killing most of its inhabitants in hours and sealing the site completely in a matter of days. The result is an extraordinarily complete snapshot of a single moment in time. The objects exactly as they were the moment the ash fell. The human bodies in the positions they were in when they died. The meals still on the tables. Kenfig's preservation is different in character. It is not a snapshot of a single moment, but a sequence of moments spanning decades and centuries, as different parts of the town were buried at different times during the long, slow abandonment. The stratigraphy of Kenfig is not a single layer, but a complex sequence. Occupation layers from different periods, destruction layers from the raids, sand accumulation layers from the dune advance, abandonment deposits where the last residents left things behind. What Kenfig offers is not a freeze frame of a single day, but a long, slow documentary of a community's life and death over several centuries.
In some ways, this makes it richer than Pompeii. Not just a single day, but a whole history, layered and legible and waiting. Section 14. Kenfig Today. Dunes, Pool, and the Ghost That Remains. The Kenfig National Nature Reserve covers around 1,200 hectares of dunes, grassland, and open water, and it is, on its own terms, entirely apart from the buried burrow beneath it, one of the most ecologically important coastal sites in Wales. It holds designated status as a site of special scientific interest and a national nature reserve. The dune system that swallowed a medieval town is now one of the finest examples of an active coastal sand dune ecosystem in the country. The irony is total and beautiful. The dunes that destroyed the town now protect it. The nature reserve designation that was created to preserve the ecology of the dunes is simultaneously, incidentally, the best possible protection for the buried medieval site beneath them. Because the reserve is protected from development, protected from the ploughing and building and infrastructure work that have destroyed so many other archaeological sites in Britain, the buried burrow of Kenfig is also protected. The medieval town sleeps under the best possible guardian, a legal framework put in place to protect birds and orchids. The ecology of the reserve is genuinely extraordinary. The dune slacks, those low, sheltered hollows between the dune ridges where the water table comes close to the surface, host rare plant communities that have largely disappeared from the wider British countryside. Marsh helleborines grow here. Fen orchids, one of the rarest plants in Britain, have been recorded in the Kenfig slacks. Round-leaved wintergreen, creeping willow, the kind of species list that makes botanists go slightly pink with excitement. The pool supports a rich assemblage of water birds. In winter, wildfowl gather in impressive numbers. Teal, tufted duck, pochard, goldeneye, and larger visitors including occasional great northern divers and the various waders that use the pool margins as a staging post during migration.
Bitterns have been recorded booming from the reed beds. The pool is, in the quiet hours before dawn, an extraordinary place. The calls of birds carrying across the still water in the dark, the smell of wet reed and cold mud, the sounds of an ecosystem going about its perpetual business. The visitor centre at Kenfig, a modest but well-equipped facility that serves both the nature reserve and the historical site, holds exhibits about the buried borough. Finds from the various excavations are displayed. Photographs document the progress of the Kenfig Society's work. Maps show the extent of the medieval town overlaid on the modern dune landscape, making visible what is otherwise literally invisible, the footprint of the streets and walls and buildings that lie beneath the grass.
The castle remains. The stub of Norman masonry that protrudes from the base of a dune are the only part of the buried town that a casual visitor can see in physical form. They are more modest than you might expect from the historical descriptions, precisely because most of the castle is still underground. What you see is the uppermost few meters of the keep, rising from the sand at an angle that suggests the underlying foundations are tilted or settled. The stone weathered and lichen-covered on the exposed faces. The Norman window arch, its rounded voussoirs still intact, is a small but perfect piece of architecture, and the contrast between its careful medieval craftsmanship and the wild hissing dune grass on all sides is striking. There is a particular quality to the light at Kenfig in the late afternoon. The angle of the sun at that hour, low over the Bristol Channel, comes across the water with a warmth that the open dune landscape does nothing to filter or diffuse. The grass catches it at the edges of each blade. The pool goes from dark to gold to a deep orange as the sun sinks. The exposed face of the castle stonework, which faces roughly westward, is lit directly by this late light, and on such afternoons the old Norman masonry almost seems to generate its own warmth, as if the stone remembered the hands that shaped it, and the centuries it has been waiting to have something to reflect. People do come here, not in the numbers that Stonehenge or Carnarvon Castle attract, but steadily, regularly. The kind of people who find their way to nature reserves and scheduled ancient monuments on their own initiative, without being driven there by coach parties and tour guides. Bird watchers with binoculars and field notebooks. Families with children who will remember, decades later, being told that there is a whole medieval town under the sand beneath their feet. Local history enthusiasts, occasional archaeologists, and people who simply want to be somewhere quiet, somewhere that the modern world has not entirely reached, somewhere that the wind is the loudest thing, and the pool is still, and the sky is enormous. For all of them, Kenfig offers what all genuinely historical places offer at their best. Not an escape from the present, but a deepening of it. A sense that the present moment stands on the accumulated weight of all the moments that preceded it, and that those past moments, the coin dropped in the 13th century,
the storm of the 14th, the last market bell of the 15th, are not entirely gone. They are just quiet, sealed, patient, present in a different way from the loud and rushing present of the living world above them.
If you stand beside the castle stub on a still day, in the right light, with the pool dark and silver to one side, and the dunes rolling away in all directions, you can feel the depth of what lies beneath you. Not just intellectually, actually physically feel it. Or perhaps it is more accurate to say that the imagination, given sufficient knowledge and sufficient stillness, can generate something that feels like physical sensation. The weight of all those buried years, the compression of the sand. Down there, streets. Down there, walls. Down there, a coin that someone dropped in a medieval market on an afternoon in the 1250s. Walking the reserve, following the paths that wind through the dune ridges and across the slack, is a particular kind of experience for anyone who knows the history. Every dip in the landscape might mark a buried building. Every slight rise might be the ghost of a medieval wall pressing upward through the sand. The whole landscape is a palimpsest, a surface written over many times. The newest writing, the dunes, the pool, the reserve, sitting on top of layers of older writing that have not been erased, merely covered. The Kenfig Society continues its work with the patience and determination that long-term local heritage organizations characteristically develop. Each significant storm event is monitored for potential exposure of buried surfaces. Each winter, with its potential for sand scour, is watched carefully. The relationship between the archaeologists and the sand is an ongoing negotiation, one that the sand usually wins in the short term, but which, over decades of patient work, has yielded an extraordinary body of knowledge about the buried burrow and the people who built it. Section 15. Britain's other buried places. Kenfig in context.
Kenfig is extraordinary, but it is not entirely alone. The coast of Britain is lined, if you know where to look, with the remnants of places that the sea or the sand or the marsh has taken, preserved in varying degrees of completeness, remembered in varying degrees of clarity. Understanding Kenfig in the context of these other lost places helps give its story proper scale and meaning. The Norfolk coast, on the other side of the country from Wales, has its own version of this story. Eccles-on-Sea, Eccles juxta mare in the medieval records, was a fishing village on the Norfolk coast that was consumed not by sand dunes, but by the North Sea itself. The village was lost to coastal erosion over centuries, its buildings toppling into the water, its church tower standing on the beach long after the settlement around it had been swallowed. That tower fell into the sea in 1895, but the medieval village beneath the beach, preserved by the same anaerobic conditions that preserve Kenfig, sealed by the beach sediments, has been periodically exposed by storms and surveyed by archaeologists. The finds from Eccles include those extraordinary medieval wells, sealed at their tops and preserved in their internal deposits for over 400 years, yielding objects of remarkable quality. A child's leather shoe, perfectly preserved, the tiny impressions of the toes still visible in the leather.
it is a find of heartbreaking intimacy, a small piece of evidence that a real child once lived in that vanished place.
At Dunwich, on the Suffolk coast, an entire medieval town lies beneath the North Sea. Dunwich was once one of the most important ports in England, a major commercial centre with numerous churches and a large population. The sea took it slowly, over centuries, eroding the soft Suffolk cliffs and taking block after block, street after street, church after church into the water. Today, the town is largely under the sea, its bells still heard ringing in storms by those with sufficient imagination and family tradition. It is not preserved in the way Kenfig is preserved. The sea is a much more destructive medium than dry sand, but it is remembered with the same peculiar affection that attaches to places that the elements have consumed. Cove Hythe, also in Suffolk, offers another variation, a village that shrank rather than drowned, its population leaving as the cliff eroded, its church eventually too large for the remaining congregation, and therefore left to become a ruin, while a smaller chapel was built inside it, a church within a church, a building that contains its own obsolescence. In Scotland, the buried village of Skara Brae in Orkney was preserved by sand in a way that parallels Kenfig. Skara Brae is a Stone Age settlement, far older than Kenfig, around 5,000 years old, but its preservation under sand is essentially the same process. A storm in 1850 blew the covering sand off the site and revealed a Neolithic village in extraordinary condition, the stone furniture of the houses still in place, the beds and storage boxes and hearths exactly as they had been when the sand covered them. Skara Brae is now a World Heritage Site and one of the most visited archaeological sites in Scotland. The parallels between Skara Brae and Kenfig are not perfect. Different periods, different cultures, different scales. But the physical mechanism of preservation is strikingly similar. Sand sealing out air and water and disturbance, acting as a slow and patient archivist of human lives. What all these lost places share, beyond their physical preservation, is a particular quality of cultural resonance. People are drawn to them. They generate folklore and story and imaginative engagement in a way that intact, fully accessible historical sites often do not. There is something about the inaccessible, the hidden, the buried, that activates the human imagination in ways that the fully visible does not. We project onto the hidden place all sorts of things that the visible place would simply resolve. The mystery, the speculation, the romantic melancholy of the lost. Kenfig, with its combination of substantial historical documentation, significant archaeological evidence, dramatic physical burial, and rich folkloric tradition, is perhaps the fullest example of this class of place in Britain. It is lost enough to be mysterious, it is documented enough to be real, it is preserved enough to reward investigation, and it is large enough, an entire medieval town, not a village, not a farm, but a chartered borough,
with a castle and a guild hall and a hospital to carry the full weight of the Britain's Pompeii comparison without buckling under it.
The other buried places of Britain are Kenfig's cousins, scattered along the vulnerable edges of the island, each one a small reminder that the human relationship with coastal landscapes has always been provisional, always conditional, always subject to revision by the sea, the sand, the storm, the slow, inexorable patience of a natural world that was here long before any of us, and will be here long after the last of our own towns and cities have been folded back into the earth. Section 16. What Kenfig Whispers. A closing meditation. It is late in the evening now, the kind of hour when the mind begins to soften at its edges, when the sharp distinctions between things blur pleasantly, and thought begins to move in longer, slower waves. The kind of hour that belongs to reflection rather than action, to settling rather than striving. Kenfig, at its heart, is a story about patience, about the enormous, impersonal patience of the natural world, which operates on timescales that make all of human history look like a single afternoon. The sand began accumulating on that Glamorgan coast long before any human being arrived to be inconvenienced by it. The Bristol Channel tides that bring the sediment have been moving for millions of years. The wind that carries the sand inland was blowing across this landscape before the first human footprint was pressed into the mud of the estuary. And against that geological patience, the people of Kenfig brought their own, very human kind of patience. The patience of a community that rebuilt itself after being burned down 6 times. The patience of burgesses who kept holding court and paying rents and maintaining their charter rights, even as the sand crept through the streets. The patience of families who kept sweeping and clearing and shoveling and planting and hoping for generations that this time the sand would stop. Both kinds of patience are, in their own way, remarkable, but only one of them won. What is left is what the sand decided to keep, and what the sand kept tells us, in its incomplete and fragmentary way, about what was important to the people who lived here. The coins they spent, the pottery they ate from, the roads they walked on, the walls they built and mended and defended, the wells they dug and lined with stone, the church where they prayed, and the churchyard where they buried their dead. These are the bones of ordinary life, preserved by extraordinary accident, waiting in the dark under the dunes for the next storm to expose them, the next careful hand to brush the sand away, the next pair of eyes to see them for the first time since the person who lost them was alive. There is a quality to the buried town, to the thought of it lying down there in the sealed dark, that I find oddly comforting. Everything about modern life tends toward the ephemeral, toward things that are temporary and disposable and constantly replaced by something newer. The idea of a place where the opposite is true,
where the weight of centuries has pressed things into a state of preservation rather than dissolution, where the ordinary objects of medieval daily life are sitting there in the dark in exactly the positions they were left in by hands that have been dust for 500 years. That is a thought that belongs to the quiet hours, to the contemplative end of the day. It is a thought with weight and texture, and a certain strange peace to it. Think of the silver penny again, struck in the reign of Henry III between 1248 and 1251, held in a hand, spent, dropped in the sand of a street in a medieval borough in South Wales, covered by a few millimetres of wind-blown sand within days perhaps of being dropped, then more sand, then more, then the storms of the early 14th century, then the advancing dune, then the full burial, the complete darkness, then 4 centuries of silence and compression and preservation, and then a hand brushing carefully at sand in the 20th century, and a coin lying bright and whole and perfectly itself on a medieval surface, exactly where it had been since the moment it slipped from someone's fingers in the 13th century.
That person did not think about the future. They were not thinking about history. They were thinking about what to buy next, or about the price of wool, or about getting home before dark, or about a conversation they'd had earlier in the day, or about the smell of bread from the baker's stall, or about the way the light was falling across the pool that afternoon. Ordinary thoughts, ordinary worries, the thoughts and worries of a person going about their life in a town they had no reason to believe would not exist forever. None of us ever have reason to believe the places we love will not exist forever, and almost none of them do. This is perhaps the deepest lesson Kenfig offers, not about sand dunes or medieval archaeology or Norman burrows or the ecological value of coastal dune systems, but about the fundamental vulnerability of the places we make and love and call home. Every settlement in human history has been provisional. Every city, every town, every village, every hamlet has existed within a set of conditions that could, under the right combination of circumstances, change irrevocably. Most of the time, the conditions don't change. Most of the time, the town survives, adapts, evolves, grows or shrinks, but persists. But sometimes, at Pompeii, at Kenfig, at Dunwich, at 100 other places scattered across the margins of the human world, the conditions do change. The volcano erupts. The sea comes closer. The sand begins to move. And what is left, if we are fortunate, is a kind of archive. A record of what people valued and what they built and what they lost. A record held not in ink on parchment, but in the physical substance of the lost place itself, in the stratigraphy of its soils, in the pottery in its wells, in the coins on its streets, in the walls that still hold the shape of the rooms they once enclosed.
The night is coming down now, softly. The light is leaving the sky above the dunes. The pool at Kenfig has gone from silver to pewter to a deep, still black. The marram grass has quieted. The wind drops here in the evening, and the constant hissing and rushing that fills the dune slacks during the day settles into a kind of low, rhythmic breathing, as if the landscape itself is drifting off to sleep. Somewhere below, in the sealed dark under all of this, the medieval town continues its long wait. The walls stand in the dark. The road surface lies smooth under its covering sand. The fragments of pottery from a 13th century kitchen sit in the precise positions they have occupied since the sand covered them. The coins lie where they were dropped. The defensive ditch holds the charcoal of fires from 700 years ago in its ancient fill. All of it waiting, patient in the way that only things that have nothing left to hurry about can be patient.
What Robert, Earl of Gloucester, planted on this wet, wind-swept margin of the Norman world around 1140 became something real. It became a town. It became a community with institutions and laws and customs and memories and stories. It became a place where children were born and old people died, and merchants argued, and priests prayed, and bakers made bread, and blacksmiths struck iron, and the market bell rang out every week across the marshes and the river and the sand. For 300 years, from the early 12th century to the middle of the 15th, that bell rang. 300 years is a long time. It is longer than the entire history of the United States of America. It is longer than the interval between the execution of Charles I and the present day. 300 years of a market bell, and of the town that gathered at its sound. And then the sand covered the bell, and the bell stopped ringing, and the town went down into the dark. If you ever find yourself in South Wales, in the stretch of coast between Porthcawl and Port Talbot, with an afternoon free and a curiosity about the kind of place most tourists drive past without a second thought, go to Kenfig, park the car on the narrow lane that leads into the reserve, walk through the gate, follow the path out into the dunes, into the hissing marram grass and the wide flat sky. Go to the pool first. Stand at the edge and look out across the water. It is dark, this pool, and still, and the horizon is the line of the dunes on the far side, all that gentle, grassy rolling. Let the legend of the drowned town come to you, not as a historical claim, but as a way of feeling the landscape, as a story the land tells about itself. The town did not drown under the pool, but something like drowning is what happened to it, and the pool is the water of that drowning, the water that collected in the hollow where the town used to be, where the river was blocked, where the sand closed the door. Then go to the castle, the stub of Norman masonry rising from the sand. Put
put your hand on the stone. The people who cut that stone and placed it here did so in the first half of the 12th century, under the direction of Robert, Earl of Gloucester, or perhaps his son, William. The stone was cut from a local quarry, probably, and hauled to the site on carts, and lifted into place by labourers whose names we will never know, who went home at the end of each working day to their houses in the growing borough, and ate their bread and drank their ale, and talked about the work, about how the walls were coming up, about how the castle was going to be something solid and permanent when it was finished.
There is something humbling about this kind of encounter with the deep past. Not humbling in a diminishing way, but humbling in the sense of being made aware of scale. The scale of time, the scale of effort that human communities have always put into making their places. Every stone in that castle was lifted by someone. Every burgage plot in the medieval borough was marked out by someone. Every post of the original timber keep was dug into the earth by someone. Thousands of individual acts of labour, intention and skill accumulated over years into something that became a town, became a community, became a place with a name and a history and a future that eventually, slowly, the sand took back. None of those labourers knew they were building something that would last 800 years. They were just building, just doing the work that needed doing in the place where they were, for the people they served or loved or owed obligations to. And yet here it is, still, the stone still here, the work still present, the effort still legible in the cut face of the masonry and the line of the buried wall and the depth of the defensive ditch. The stone is still here, mostly buried, but still here, still present, still marking the spot where a community decided 800 and some years ago to make it stand. The sand, of course, has the last word. The sand always has the last word. It moved across this landscape before any human being came to build on it, and it will move across it long after the last of our own structures have fallen and been absorbed. The nature reserve will eventually give way to something else. The pool may change its shape. The dune crests will shift with each decade's storms. In some future century, after some future storm of particular violence, the medieval town may be exposed again, more completely perhaps than it has ever been since it was abandoned. Some future archaeologist, with tools and techniques we cannot imagine from here, may stand in the sunlight above a medieval street, above intact walls and intact floors, and the intact material of a community's daily life, and see Kenfig for what it truly is. The thought of that future exposure, of centuries more of preservation, followed by a revelation we will not live to see, is one of the stranger pleasures available to anyone who thinks seriously about places like Kenfig. We are, in a sense, in the middle of the story. The burial began around 1300. The full story of the town's recovery and understanding has not yet been written. Somewhere between the 13th century, when the sand first began to move seriously across the fields of the borough,
and whatever century eventually sees the systematic excavation of the full site, we are positioned about a third of the way through, witnesses to the middle chapters, aware that there is much more to come, but unable to read ahead.
Or the sand may simply continue to hold it, continue to keep it sealed, dark, still, and whole, in the way it has been kept for 600 years. There are worse fates for a town than to be held in the patient dark of the earth, preserved rather than destroyed, waiting rather than gone. The sand does not mourn what it covers. It simply keeps it, perfectly, quietly, indefinitely. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is more than enough. Perhaps to be kept in the dark, in the cold, in the perfect stillness beneath the hissing grass, perhaps that is its own form of continuation. Not life, but not oblivion. Something in between that has no good name in any language. Tonight, lying in whatever bed or chair or corner of the world has become yours for these nighttime hours, let Kenvig settle into your mind with you. Not as an anxious thought, not as a thing to mourn, but as a kind of company. The company of a place that endured everything. The raids, the plague, the storms, the slow encroachment of the sand, and was not destroyed, but preserved. The company of a community that built something real and true and lasting on the edge of the marsh, on the edge of the Bristol Channel, on the edge of the known world, and whose streets and walls and coins and pottery are all still down there, in the dark under the dunes, perfectly, quietly, patiently themselves. The marram grass is hissing in the evening wind above them. The pool is still. The sand holds everything. Let the weight of that settle down through you, the way sleep does, slowly and completely, from the top of your head to the soles of your feet. You do not need to hold anything. You do not need to stay alert. The buried town has been patient for 600 years, and it will be patient still through this night and every night. It requires nothing from you except, perhaps, for a moment, to be known, to be thought about, to be felt, even at this great remove of time and distance, as a real place where real people once lived real lives. A medieval market, a Norman castle, a guild hall, a hospital, a church, a school, probably, a baker, certainly, a blacksmith hammering iron in the early morning while the town woke around him, children chasing each other through the burgage plots, the smell of horses and mud and wood smoke and the salt wind coming off the channel, the sound of the market bell. All of it sealed now, under the sand, under the dunes, under the particular slow mercy of preservation. All of it still there. If these quiet journeys into the corners of history help you find your way to sleep, please do take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It means more than you might think. Boring History for Sleep has been going for over a year,
built one slow story at a time, and there are still only around 160 of you here. If you have found something restful and interesting in this, please share it. It costs nothing, and it helps the channel grow, so more sleepless people can find their way.
Tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is on your clock. It is oddly comforting to know who else is out there in the dark, drifting off to the slow march of history. Good night. Sleep well. The sand is patient, and so am I.